Philip here from Nathan Trust, and welcome to another one of our tax webinars. This week we're talking about the Import One-Stop Shop, which is the new EU tax regime which went live on July 1st. The webinar is in a Q&A format, so please get your questions in early and we'll do our best to answer them. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel within an hour or so of us finishing. As ever, we have David Bruton, who heads up our tax team here in Nathan Trust, answering all your questions. So David, welcome.
Thanks, Philip.
Let's get into it. I suppose the best place to start really is just a kind of a brief introduction of IOSS, and then we'll get into some of the questions that our customers are asking us.
Okay, sure. So I suppose IOSS, it's specifically for goods that are coming into the EU from outside the EU and are being sold directly to end consumers or private individuals rather than to businesses. So I suppose to contrast it with the historic position was that if you were shipping goods into Europe to end consumers and the goods were worth less than 22 euros, you didn't have to worry about VAT at point of entry or duty or anything like that. And if they were worth more than 22 euros, what was supposed to happen was that they'd be declared at that value, and VAT at point of entry would have to be paid before they could be released to the end customer. So to maybe streamline this process, what the tax authorities in Europe have done is they've said, firstly, the limit for duty being applicable is 150 euros, and if for goods in a consignment worth up to 150 euros, the supplier can register for IOSS in Europe. They deal with the VAT, and the goods then pass straight through to the end consumer without the need to deal with VAT at point of entry or be held at customers or anything like that.
Okay, question here from David. How do you register for IOSS in Ireland? What's the process?
So the process is reasonably straightforward. It's a matter of registering with revenue here. Now the only complication to that, I suppose, is that where the business is established outside of the EU and doesn't have any establishment within the EU, they will probably need an intermediary to register them with revenue. So the EU have said that if you're from a country that the EU has concluded a mutual VAT agreement with, you don't need an intermediary. At the moment, the only country on that list is Norway. Now we'd expect it would expand over time. So a company would need an intermediary to register them with revenue. And I suppose this is slightly different to having a tax agent that most people would be used to, that would register them for taxes and then maybe deal with the filings. The intermediary there's a bit more obligation on the intermediary. So the intermediary can be jointly and severally liable for the IOSS VAT liability if the business doesn't deal with it or has a history of non-compliance. Revenue can make the intermediary jointly and severally liable.
Okay, yeah, there's a couple of questions on the intermediary as well we get to, but just to be clear on it, is that if say we're dealing with a lot of people from the UK, because this is relevant for UK because it's outside the EU as well. But if you're a UK company, you can register for IOS in Ireland. You don't need an Irish company. You just need the intermediary. That's the only step.
That's all. So you don't need to worry about establishing a subsidiary or anything like that here. You can just register your existing UK business for IOSS in Ireland. That covers all of Europe, one registration for all of Europe. You will need an intermediary in Ireland to do it for you at the moment. If the UK concludes that mutual VAT agreement with the EU down the line, you won't necessarily need an intermediary. You'd probably still use a tax agent to register and file on your behalf, but that tax agent's obligations would be a lot less. It would be similar to what we'd be used to here, where they're just filing the return on your behalf, but the liability remains with the business. So that we'll see if and when that comes, the change from needing that intermediary.
Okay, and so typically you I need to identify an intermediary, someone like ourselves, an accountancy or financial services firm, that'll A, act as the intermediary, but B, do the registration for you. So how long does it take to register then?
That's a bit of an unknown, I suppose, at the moment, because we're at the early days of it. It shouldn't take too long because there's no, I suppose we contrast it sometimes with tax registrations for VAT, and that can take quite a lot of time here in Ireland. With this, there's, as long as you've all the paperwork together at the outset, at a guess, I would estimate probably 1 to 2 weeks, something like that.
Okay. And can it be backdated?
No, it's applicable from the date that it's granted, so
Okay.
it can't be backdated.
There's a couple of people here who are selling on marketplaces like Amazon and eBay. Do they need their own IOSS number?
They don't. So the rules, the IOSS rules have introduced this idea of kind of a double transaction, an artificial double transaction. So where it's, say, Amazon that you're selling through a platform like that, you're deemed to sell the goods to them, and then they're deemed to sell it to the end consumer in Europe, so that Amazon would have the obligation to deal with the VAT on the sale to the end consumer. So a company who's selling through Amazon in that circumstance where the goods are coming from outside the EU wouldn't necessarily need their own IOSS number unless they also sell off their own website or some other channel.
Okay, so if they could have 2 sales outlets, so they could be selling X amount of product in iOS and through Amazon, which they don't need an IOSS number. And then if they're selling another bits through their own website direct to customers in the EU below the 150 euros, then they do need for that, and they just report on the direct sales they make themselves.
Exactly, and I suppose just to point out at this stage, the registration for IOSS at the moment isn't mandatory. It's a voluntary scheme that you can opt into. And I suppose people might ask, why would I opt into this and take on the obligation of this filing? I suppose there's a couple of reasons you do it. One, your end consumer in the EU is no longer having to deal with that at point of entry. Your shipping agent isn't dealing with it on your behalf or trying to get 10 euros or whatever off the person who's bought your product online, and they've been dealing with the shipping to them. The other thing to be aware of is, I suppose, historically there was a 22 euro threshold, where if the goods were worth underneath 22 euro, you didn't need to worry about that. You didn't need to worry about duty. That's gone now. So if you don't opt into IOSS, all the goods that are coming into the EU to end consumers that you're selling, VAT at point of entry will apply to them. And if it's over 150 euros, then VAT and duty will apply to them. So it makes life a lot easier for consumers ultimately that are buying the goods off you.
Yeah, and I think it makes life an awful lot easier for companies as too, because like I know there's like we can tend to be a bit negative. Oh, it's new regulation, it's new tax, but there's thousands of companies out there, and we've worked with them that had to register for VAT in multiple jurisdictions, and like that is not an easy process. Now with this, they just do it in Ireland, all in the English language, and that's valid for all 27 EU countries.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea behind it is they are trying their best to reduce the compliance burden. So it's, as you say, it's one return a month, filed through revenue here in Ireland. All the interactions with revenue here in Ireland. Not that you'd expect very much on a system like this. Our experience with similar filings is that you don't tend to have a lot of interaction with revenue. So you file once a month, and that's pretty much it. But your point of contact is revenue in Ireland. You don't necessarily have to go and deal with each tax authority in each jurisdiction in the EU.
Yeah, and that's hugely advantageous. Just another question on the intermediary. Do I need one? I guess the short answer is yes for that in Ireland, isn't it?
Yes, unless your business is based in Norway at the moment, or you need one.
Yeah, and just be careful, because I know there's like this is obviously a big space, but there is a lot of responsibility and liability for the intermediary. So anybody offering this service for cheap on the cheap is probably not providing the intermediary service properly. They're probably not valid, or like the intermediary needs to be registered with the tax authority in the relevant country. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. So they need to be registered with revenue here in Ireland, not only as a tax agent, but specifically as an intermediary for IOSS.
Okay, so watch out. Make sure you ask that question when you do sign up. The question here is what about consignment value above 150 euros?
So consignment value above 150 euros, it's the traditional treatment where it's VAT and duty at point of entry, and you don't have an option to include that in your IOSS return. Now, the value of 150 euros, how that's kind of measured is it's the intrinsic value of the goods. So if you ship the goods and your invoice says 140 euros for goods and 20 euros for shipping, for example, that's under the 150 euros where you separately disclose your shipping costs.
Okay.
If you sold the same goods and it just said 160 euros for the goods, but it included 20 euros of shipping, that's over the 150 euros. You haven't specifically identified that 20 euros of it is shipping, so it's over. So, but yeah, I suppose to answer the question, if it's over 150 euros for the goods, it's the traditional treatment, VAT and duty at point of entry.
Okay. And how often do I need to file an IOSS return? It's monthly, isn't it?
It's monthly, so it's you file monthly and it's due by the end of the month following.
Okay. So if you're saying for filing for August, you do that in September and you make the payment in September as well, isn't that correct?
Yeah, so you should have everything submitted and paid by the end of September.
Okay. Can I reclaim VAT on returned goods with IOSS?
So I suppose this is, if I'm interpreting this correctly, this is a situation where you've sold goods to someone and then they've sent them back to you and said there's a fault or I don't want them or whatever.
Yes.
So what you would do is you would just account for that in your next IOSS return. So if you sold the goods in August and they're returned in September, you'd include a negative figure for that item in your September figures.
Okay, so the answer is yes, you can.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up in a few minutes. So if anybody has questions, be sure to get them in. Just the last one really is around the enforcement, and we get asked this a couple of times, and it's not spoken about too much, but like my view on it is from an enforcement perspective, what the EU tends to do with its regulations, it brings in the law, it kind of signals it brings in the law, and then enforcement can not only be on a country by country basis, but also it tends to be reasonably gradual. It's not the hammer comes down and there's change from that particular date.
Yeah.
But what's your view on enforcement and how it will pan out?
I kind of agree with you there. I think at the moment their emphasis is on getting people to understand the system and getting people registered, getting the returns in correctly, and then, as you say, it tends to be gradual and the enforcement tends to come in later. I suppose what we can maybe look to for a bit of an example is the mini one-stop shop system we had in place for digital services. So, like website subscriptions, all that sort of thing. That's very similar to the current system that's coming in that it was one return through one tax authority for all of Europe. And what we found there is that as that system bedded in and has been there over a period of time, certain tax authorities are quicker to impose interest on late payment, for example, than others. So you're filing your return through revenue here in Ireland, but it's tax covering all of Europe. So you might find that one particular jurisdiction, if you're filing late, they may impose interest on that late payment of the tax liability, but not all will. So yeah, I'd agree that at the moment the emphasis is on understanding the system, getting people up and running. The emphasis then will probably shift to kind of compliance. And I think if you look at Revenue's guidance on this, what they're saying is if you haven't filed, if you haven't paid, 10 days later, you'll get a reminder from Revenue to file the return or pay the liability that you have returned. So at the moment, it's not a big stick approach. I suppose it's a kind of a help people to be compliant approach.
Okay, and if you're a company that has been kind of sitting there watching it, you've been still trading as normal, haven't registered for IOSS, and kind of 6 months later, you decide, okay, we got to do this. There's Revenue aren't really going to penalize you for being 6 months late to the party, are they?
Not at all, because I suppose with IOSS, to kind of maybe walk through the mechanics of it, just to understand it, once you're registered for IOSS, you give your IOSS number to your shipping agent, and when the goods hit the point of entry into Europe, the shipping agent will give will have the IOSS number on the documentation that gets processed for VAT and customs. So it's kind of pre-cleared at that point, and it gets cleared for being delivered straight to the customer without being stopped for VAT at point of entry. So if you're late to the party and you don't register, say, till kind of early 2022, what will happen is that as your goods are coming into Europe, they'll be stopped at the point of entry for VAT before being released to your customer. So you will inadvertently, the VAT will be paid, but it's just it'll be paid by VAT at point of entry, which your shipper will have to deal with. So I suppose over time, if you kind of think what are going to be the incentives for businesses to shift to this model, I'm imagining your shipping agent's going to be much happier if you're IOSS registered and they're not dealing with multiple instances of having to collect VAT from the end customer before the goods can be released. So in a roundabout kind of way, it will probably reduce your admin by registering for IOSS. If you were to ask me what's going to transpire into the future, I think it's quite possible that, albeit it's a voluntary scheme at the moment, that, I don't know, it may become mandatory or it may become more incentivized to use it rather than stick to the traditional system.
I think, but it'll certainly be enforcement. You will certainly see it from a shipper's perspective. Like, you'll see shippers holding product until they have the idea, because there might be some liability for them in it. And like tax authorities in Ireland, Italy, France, and all, they're heavily motivated to get this right, because it's a lot of money to them.
It is, absolutely. And it's, again, if you look at the admin burden, it's a lot easier for the tax authorities to deal with it, where you self-declare the VAT to them and pay it over to them in a lump sum, rather than lots of individual transactions having to be flagged and dealt with as the goods are coming into the country.
100%. And the other thing too is that there will be a pan-European database of IOSS numbers that companies will be able to check. It's being built at the moment, and there's currently a pan-European database for VAT and Vs, where you can go in and put a number in and it comes back with the company's number. So this is something the EU, this is here to stay. This will be properly enforced. So even companies are still getting away with it. A lot of businesses are still business as usual. Someday in the next few weeks or months, it'll stop being business as usual very quickly.
Yeah, and I think particularly if you take a business that sells quite a lot of goods into Europe, and quite a lot of those goods are under the €150 mark, I think, once systems are set up to deal with it, it can be dealt with quite painlessly, relatively speaking. I think the traditional method will become the more cumbersome one very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we leave it at that. Thanks for everybody for attending. Good turnout as ever. Thank you, David, for your time. And as I said, we'll put a recording on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. Bye-bye.